Welcome everyone to an edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name's Eric Lupo. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So this week, we're continuing with looking at the history of the founding of the United States. And so we started off several episodes ago looking at the Reformation and how that impacted how folks viewed the relationship between church and state. Then we narrowed in on the Reformation in England and looked at how England struggled between the authority of Parliament and the authority of the king, such as the divine right of kings, things like that, and also how they handled the issue of religious liberty, specifically between Christian denominations or between different Christian beliefs. And then we looked at the English Civil War and how the American colonies viewed the English Civil War. And the result of the English Civil War was that Parliament became much more powerful, took upon itself authority and power that had previously belonged to the king. And now the king was in many ways subservient, maybe a bit too subservient to Parliament, but that the American colonies viewed themselves and understood themselves to be co-equal with Parliament. Because, like I said before, how the English Commonwealth system was set up was that, like, Scotland had their own Parliament, England had their own Parliament, but both of them were under one monarch. And in the same way, the colonies also functioned. They had their own legislative and governing bodies that would tax the colonists, and they were under the single monarch that was also in charge of England and Scotland. That's kind of where we left off. And so now we're going to look at the historical events leading up to the American War for Independence. So at this time, English Parliament is asserting itself and essentially seeking to treat American colonies not like co-equal governing bodies, but under Parliament's authority, which would be a violation of, well, the already established relationship. So just to give you an example, looking at the colony of Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges in 1701 demonstrates that Pennsylvania is under the authority of the king, but also establishes its own governing bodies. And here is what one section of the Charter of Privileges says. It says, quote, "For the well-governing of this province, there shall be an assembly, chosen yearly, to consist of 4 persons from each county, of virtue, wisdom, and ability, upon the 1st day of October, and shall sit on the 14th day of October at Philadelphia, unless the governor and council shall see cause to pick another place within the province. This assembly will have power to choose a speaker, other officers, and shall be judges for qualifications of their own members, and will sit upon their own adjournment, appoint committees, prepare bills to pass into laws, impeach criminals, and redress grievances, and shall have all other powers and privileges of an assembly, according to the rights of the freeborn subjects of England, and as is usual in any of the king's plantations in America." End quote. So the agreement between the colony of Pennsylvania and the king of England is that, look, we're going to have our own assemblies. They're going to do all the things that any assembly, a governing body, is able to do. Of course, under one monarch, but all of the citizens of Pennsylvania, all of the colonists of Pennsylvania, will have the same rights of freeborn subjects of England. No different. Okay? So that's the situation. And now you have a problem when the English Parliament is beginning to assert itself as kind of the ultimate authority. And it's interesting because the English Civil War was a battle, essentially, over the divine right, but not just divine right of kings. in some sense, the divine right of Parliament versus the divine right of kings. And of course, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Parliament becomes preeminent. And one individual, a British political theorist in the late 1700s, who was born in Switzerland but lived in England, his name is Jean-Louis Delhomme, and he said this, he said, quote, "It is a fundamental principle with the English lawyers that Parliament can do anything except make a woman into a man or a man into a woman," end quote. So kind of a little tongue-in-cheek joke there, although it's, I guess in today's context with regards to transgenderism, that's a little strange. Maybe Parliament can do that now. But he was basically making the argument that, well, according to English lawyers, Parliament can do no wrong. Previously, it was the king can do no wrong. But ever since the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, now it's Parliament. And so what you have going on in the 1700s, leading up to the American War for Independence, an increasing battle between two different assemblies. Now it's not really a battle between the king and a parliament. It's now between the American colonial governments and English parliament. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, well, why is King George III considered to be the problem? Okay, why does everyone, teach in school that, we were rebelling against King George? Well, it's because it was the duty of the king to uphold his end of the bargain, of the covenant. Because the covenant, the agreement was that he would be the monarch over the colonies and they would have their own assemblies. And so his job was to recognize that, affirm that, protect that, okay, and defend their rights. And he was to not allow Parliament to put the colonies under their authority. Okay, but see, he allowed that to happen. In many ways, King George was working through Parliament and allowing Parliament to abuse the colonies. Now, this only got worse with the French and Indian War in the mid-1700s. That put a significant level of stress on the relationship between Parliament and the colonies. Because, well, as a result of the war, there was an increased debt and a need for money. Okay? But instead of allowing the colonies to manage their own taxation, a portion of which would go to the crown, Parliament decided to tax the colonies directly itself and essentially bypass and completely ignore the colonial governments that were already representing the people of the colonies and taxing them. So just to give an example, one of the first ones is the Sugar Act of 1764. Now this was a tax on imported molasses and sugar from the French and the Dutch colonies because the French and the Dutch West Indies were producing fairly cheap molasses and sugar. And so Parliament basically wants to tax that import. And Parliament required that American captains had to keep a detailed log of their cargo, and they could have their cargo confiscated by the British if they did not follow the regulations and requirements. Now, one of our founding fathers, Samuel Adams, who lived in Boston, he responded to the Sugar Act, and here is what he wrote to the Boston representatives that were going to go to the Massachusetts General Assembly and begin, deliberating. Here's what he said to them. He said, quote, "You are being chosen by the freeholders and inhabitants of the town of Boston to represent them in the General Assembly. This affords you the strongest testimony of the confidence which they place in your integrity and capacity. By this choice, they have delegated to you the power of acting on their public concerns in general as your own prudence directs you, always reserving to themselves the right of expressing their mind and giving you fresh instruction upon particular matters as they at any time shall judge proper. For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? This, we believe, annihilates our charter right to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes at our British privileges, which, as we have never forfeited them, we hold in common with our fellow subjects who are natives of Britain. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? End quote. And that's kind of where we get the mantra, no taxation without representation. Because the point is that we already have our own governing bodies that pass laws, regulate us, and tax us. Because this was already established many, many, many years ago in the founding of the colonies with the king. So why is the king allowing Parliament to tax them directly and basically ignore and bypass and usurp the governing bodies? So this increases tension, of course, between the colonies and Parliament. Now you have other acts like the Stamp Act of 1765, which was a tax on certain papers and documents and newspapers and pamphlets and even playing cards. And this tax had to be paid using British sterling currency rather than the colonial currency. So you see what's going on here is that this is an attempt, again, to undermine and kind of eradicate colonial authority. They can't even coin their own currency. You have to use British currency rather than colonial currency. And those who violated the Stamp Act could be tried in the Vice Admiralty Court, which is kind of like a military naval court. It doesn't require juries, and it didn't have to be in the colonies. So essentially you see an attempt to remove the authority of not just passing laws, but also judging and enforcing laws out of the hands of the colonies and taking them into the hands of English Parliament. And so in 1766, with all of this controversy going on, English Parliament decides to assert itself and make it very, very clear what the relationship now is between the colonists and Parliament. So here's what it says. It says, quote, "An act for the better securing the dependency of His Majesty's dominions in America upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain, whereas several of the houses of representatives in His Majesty's colonies and plantations in America have of late against law claimed to themselves or to the general assemblies of the same the sole and exclusive right of imposing duties and taxes upon His Majesty's subjects in the said colonies and plantations, and have, in pursuance of such claim, passed certain votes, resolutions, and orders derogatory to the legislative authority of Parliament and inconsistent with the dependency of the said colonies and plantations upon the Crown of Great Britain. May it therefore please your most excellent Majesty that it may be declared, and be it declared, by the King's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords and Commons in this Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, that the colonies and plantations in America have been, are, and of right ought to be subordinate to, and dependent upon the imperial crown and Parliament of Great Britain, and that the King's Majesty, by and with the advice of the consent of the Lords and Commons of Great Britain in Parliament assembled, had and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, subjects of the Crown of Great Britain in all cases whatsoever. And be it further declared and enacted by the authority that all resolutions, votes, orders, proceedings in any of the colonies whereby the power and authority of the Parliament of Great Britain to make laws and statutes as aforesaid is denied or drawn into question are hereby declared to be null and void to all in purposes whatsoever." A lot of legal language there, but basically the summary is you have no power anymore, you colonial governments. You will not pass any laws. You will not pass any taxes. You will not do anything. Everything that belongs to the colonies is now under the authority of the Parliament of Great Britain. And of course, this law gets sent to the king, King George III, and he is okay with it. He says, sounds good. Of course, this doesn't make anything better. And then you have the prelude to the Boston Tea Party, which is the Tea Act of 1773. So just a little bit of context there. Most tea at the time was imported from the Dutch. And in order to kind of make the colonists purchase British tea, the Parliament gave exemptions to taxes and duties to the British East India Company. So that allowed them to undercut competitors. And the colonists, though, still had to pay taxes on the tea when it came in. So that obviously wasn't very nice. So the Boston Tea Party, the response of the colonists, of course, throwing the tea into the harbor, that led to Parliament passing several acts called the Coercive Acts. So first, Parliament closed the Port of Boston. So the Port of Boston was going to be closed until they paid for all the tea that they threw into the water. The Massachusetts Government Act took away the right of the government of Massachusetts to govern themselves. The Administration of Justice Act made it that any trials of government officials in the colonies took place in England instead of the colonies. And the Quartering Act mandated that colonists house British soldiers as necessary. From here, you don't just have an immediate call to arms. And this is where the American War for Independence really shows itself as a justified war and as something that was based in the rights of English citizens and in many ways demonstrated a bit of long suffering and patience on the part of the colonists because they send several petitions to the King of England to ask him to stop allowing Parliament to usurp the authority of the colonial governments. One was sent in 1774, petition to King George III, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's several pages long, but it was written and sent by the First Continental Congress from Philadelphia in October of 1774, and it basically lays out all of the issues that have been happening that they think are a clear violation of the rights of Englishmen. So I'm just going to read a couple of them. First, quote, assemblies have been frequently and injuriously dissolved and commerce burdened with many useless and oppressive restrictions. And then another one, quote, by several acts of Parliament made in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th years of your Majesty's reign, duties are imposed on us for the purpose of raising a revenue, and the powers of Admiralty and Vice-Admiralty courts are extended beyond their limits, whereby our property is taken from us without our consent. The trial by jury in many cases is abolished. Enormous forfeitures are incurred for slight offenses. Vexatious informers are exempted from paying damages to which they are justly liable, and oppressive security is required from owners before they are allowed to defend their rights. And then they go on and reference the coercive acts of Parliament, which blocked the Port of Boston and basically abolished the governing power of Massachusetts. And they go on to say, and this is just to the king, by the way, so they're not talking to Parliament because they're not under Parliament's authority. And that's the whole point, right? Like, so you could say, well, if Parliament's doing all these bad things, why don't they just talk to Parliament? Well, that would just give up the farm. Like, that would just demonstrate that they're under Parliament's authority. Okay? No, they're going to the rightful authority over them, which is the king, who should be not letting Parliament do these things. So the petition to the king says this. It says, quote, to a sovereign who glories in the name of Britain, the bare recital of these acts must, we presume, justify the loyal subjects who fly to the foot of his throne and implore his clemency for protection against them. And then they say, quote, the duty to your majesty and regard for the preservation of ourselves and our posterity command us to entreat your royal attention. And as your majesty enjoys the signal distinction of reigning over free men, we apprehend the language of freemen cannot be displeasing. Your royal indignation, we hope, will rather fall on those designing and dangerous men who, daringly interpose themselves between your royal person and your faithful subjects, and for several years past have employed to dissolve the bonds of society by abusing your Majesty's authority, misrepresenting your American subjects, and prosecuting the most desperate and irritating projects of oppression, have at length compelled us to disturb your Majesty's repose by our complaints. We ask but for peace, liberty, and safety. We wish not a diminution of the prerogative, nor do we solicit the grant of any new right in our favor. Your royal authority over us and our connection with Great Britain we shall always carefully and zealously endeavor to support and maintain. And they go on to say, quote, we therefore most earnestly beseech your Majesty that your royal authority and interposition may be used for our relief, and that a gracious answer may be given to this petition. And that's the end of the petition. So again, they're just basically asking the king to really do his job and protect their rights as English citizens and as the subjects of the king, because Parliament does not have authority over the colonial governments. Of course, this does not actually work, as we all know, but a second petition was made in July of 1775, so 1 year prior to the Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress again sends another petition to the king, but what's interesting is that not only do they send it to the king, but they send a separate petition to the people of England. They're still not talking to Parliament directly. They're talking to the king, and then they're also making a petition to all of the people of England, basically as fellow Englishmen. So, again, I won't read the whole thing, but they reiterate the issues that have not been addressed. I'll read a few sections though here. One says, quote, your Majesty's ministers, persevering in their measures and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defense, and have engaged us in a controversy so abhorrent to the affections of your still faithful colonists, that when we consider whom we must oppose in this contest, and if it continues, what may be the consequences, our own particular misfortunes are accounted by us only as parts of our distress. I highlight that portion because obviously there's already been some conflict between the British Army and the American colonists and militias. But what the colonists are saying here is that they are still not blaming the king per se, but they're saying it's his ministers. These individuals, this parliament also, is causing some great problems here, including conflict. And the colonists are basically saying, look, we have no choice in this matter but to arm ourselves and to resist. But at this point, they don't want to separate from the authority of the king. And they go on to say, we therefore beseech your Majesty that your royal authority and influence may be graciously interposed to procure us relief from our afflicting fears and jealousies occasioned by the system before mentioned, and to settle peace through every part of your dominions. And so the colonists do not want to overthrow the king, or even at this point to separate from the king. But it's kind of like a last appeal to the king to not let Parliament abuse its authority. Of course, as you know, that does not work. So then the Continental Congress makes a declaration as to why the Americans are taking up arms against the British Army and the English Parliament. And this also was published in 1775. And I'm just going to read a couple excerpts from this. Here is what the declaration says. It says, quote, but why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? By one statute, it is declared that Parliament can of right make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? Not a single man of those who assume it is chosen by us, or is subject to our control or influence, but on the contrary, they are all of them exempt from the operation of such laws, and an American revenue, if not diverted from the ostensible purposes for which it is raised, would actually lighten their own burdens in proportion as they increase ours. We saw the misery to which such despotism would reduce us. We, for 10 years, incessantly and ineffectually besieged the throne as supplicants. We reasoned, we remonstrated with Parliament in the most mild and decent language. End quote. So what are they pointing out here? Well, they're pointing out that every governing body has the power to tax, and those governing bodies are representative of the people. Okay, The issue with Parliament, one of the issues with Parliament taxing the American colonies directly, is that now English Parliament can raise revenue without taxing their own people. And this is contrary to how it's supposed to work in the English system. All right. And they go on to say that for basically 10 years, they had been making petitions and they've been on the receiving end of these abuses by Parliament and essentially by the king who's allowing Parliament to do these things. I'm just going to go to the end here and read this section. Quote, "Lest this declaration should disquiet the minds of our friends and fellow subjects in any part of the empire, we assure them that we mean not to dissolve that union which has so long and so happily subsisted between us, and which we sincerely wish to see restored. Necessity has not yet driven us into that desperate measure, or induced us to excite any other nation to war against them. We have not raised armies with ambitious designs of separating from Great Britain and establishing independent states. We fight not for glory or for conquest. We exhibit to mankind the remarkable spectacle of a people attacked by unprovoked enemies, without any imputation or even suspicion of offense. They boast of their privileges in civilization, and yet proffer no milder conditions than servitude or death. In our own native land, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright, and which we ever enjoyed till the late violation of it, for the protection of our property, acquired solely by the honest industry of our forefathers and ourselves, against violence actually offered, we have taken up arms. We shall lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, and all danger of their being renewed shall be removed, and not before." So even this declaration in 1775, for the reasons why they're picking up weapons, they make it very, very clear that even now they're not trying to separate from Great Britain, and that they really believe, and I think they can make a strong case for, that they are on the defensive here, and they really are defending themselves against unjust actions and aggressions on the part of Parliament working through the king, and the king not doing his job of keeping the covenants that were established between the throne and the colonies many decades prior. And so really it's an issue of breaking covenant. That is what it really comes down to. The king is failing to hold up his end of the covenant, and Parliament is violating the rights of fellow Englishmen. Now, even members of Parliament recognized this problem. One of them was Edmund Burke, a very famous member of English Parliament, and he sympathized with the Americans on these issues. Here's what he says. He says, quote, "In effect, we suffer as much at home by this loosening of all ties and this concussion of all established opinions as we do abroad. For in order to prove that the Americans have no right to their liberties, we are every day endeavoring to subvert the maxims which preserve the whole spirit of our own. To prove that the Americans ought not to be free, we are obliged to depreciate the value of freedom itself, and we never seem to gain a paltry advantage over them in debate, without attacking some of those principles or deriding some of those feelings for which our ancestors have shed their blood." End quote. Now, in that speech he's given, that quote, that small quotation I gave, that's part of a broader speech where he's actually highlighting the irony, because obviously he is not on the majority opinion of Parliament. So he sees Parliament doing all these things, and he is highlighting that, look, in your effort to try to show that the Americans have no rights and liberties, you are actually undermining our own rights and liberties because you're attacking the very same spirit. Essentially, you can't attack and undermine the liberties of the Americans because they're Englishmen. You can't do that. But then at the same time, highlight your own liberties and freedoms as Englishmen. You can't do that. He's seeing the hypocrisy there. He's seeing the irony behind it. And so in that way, he is sympathetic to the rights of the Americans as fellow Englishmen, and that those rights should not be trampled upon by anybody, lest alone English Parliament, who themselves shed blood in the English Civil War and other periods of history to gain their own rights. If you remember several episodes ago, we talked about how one of the reasons for the English Civil War was that the king was implementing taxes upon the British without the consent of Parliament. And that was no taxation without representation. And that was one of the main issues that caused Parliament to assert itself against the kings at the time. And so now, in effect, Parliament's doing the same thing. They're imposing taxation without representation in America, and Edmund Burke is basically highlighting just how hypocritical and ironic that is. And so, to kind of conclude this episode, I would argue that from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective, I would say the Americans did it right. They endured much. They petitioned the king. They were trying to uphold their end of the covenant. The king had violated his end of the covenant. And then at some point, you have to defend yourself against aggression. And the war was very defensive in nature. And they were not trying right away to separate themselves from the British Empire and the crown. That would come later. So this situation is one of the best examples, I would say, of just war theory and a proper demonstration of civil disobedience and resistance to a higher authority, namely the king. And this was all grounded not just in English common law and the rights of English citizens, because those things originate out of a biblical worldview, out of God's law, which had been established in England by King Alfred in the Middle Ages. So anyways, I hope that you found this useful and informative. Sure, we cover a lot of these things in school, but I don't think they cover it properly. And I know that when I was in school, I remember in high school in history class, they had the teacher had a debate over should the Americans separate from England. And the class was split legitimately. Maybe even more than half the class voted or argued that the Americans were wrong, and they were just basically complaining. And looking back on it, I think that was such a disservice. The teacher did not cover the things that we've been looking at the past several weeks, and the historical context was essentially lost and misconstrued. And if you do that, of course it looks like the Americans just complaining about having to pay some taxes on some things, right? Whoop-de-doo, big deal, right? That's not the issue. The issue is never having to pay taxes on stuff. That's not the issue. The issue is who's doing it and why. Even today, if you were to receive a bill or a tax from another state, we live in Pennsylvania. If I got a tax bill from California, I would not pay it because California does not have authority over me. I don't do work in California. They have no reason or business to tax me. That is a parallel of what was happening back then with English Parliament trying to tax the colonies who already had their own governing bodies to tax themselves. So that being said, if you have any questions, comments, please email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com or go on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, look for Governed by God or Eric Loopold, and you can message me there. So we will continue in future episodes to look at the founding of the United States. And so I hope that you will join me then. And until then, take care and God bless.